we're going to call our young friend Lawrence. Lawrence, by the time he was 6 or 7 years old, had pretty well gone through the Greek classics and had mastered them, and to all of his community's awe, had attempted to go past that. Further, he did something very strange. By the time he was 8, he converted to the Catholicism from Baptist faith, none of his family having done the same, and he did it on the basis of his literature background, all of his background in the Greek classics. Can't explain that, nor would I even want to try to explain that. But the offshoot of that was that the bishop in the state in which Lawrence lived picked him up at about 8 years old, and they put him away into a private school, private tutor, and everything else. The end result was Lawrence was asocial, strange, isolated, in a world of his own, and kept on reading, kept on studying. In the meantime, I have to bring myself into this. I joined a monastery in the same state and a little later in life, and by the time I was in my mid-30s, I was now in final vows and the last stages of before you finish and take the whole works as a monk. And young Lawrence I had met in class. As a matter of fact, I was probably old enough to be his father. I was awed by him and just amazed, and at the time I did take my final vows, I was first eligible to have a private room in the narrow confines of the monastery. Instead, I opted to choose Lawrence as a roommate, which he took as a signal honor for some strange reason. But then this life began. Lawrence, when he came into my room and introduced himself as a roommate now, who we of course knew each other, said, "Before I can talk to you, I want to give you a list of 10 books which you must read before we can communicate." Now, if you're old enough to be someone's father, you could be insulted by this. But instead, I was really quite selfish about this. I was anxious to drink from this young genius that I had seen perform in philosophy and in literature in class, at least from a distance, and now I got to see it straight on. Well, I want to tell you about the 10 books. I did read them, and I didn't have any qualms about reading them, and it turned a whole new world open to me, especially in relationships. The most important book was Sigrid Undset's Kristen Lavransdatter, the 1930s story of the Swedish conversion to Catholicism around the 13th century. Notice the conversion to Catholicism. The trilogy won a Pulitzer Prize and is an extraordinary set of books. I hadn't even thought about reading them in my life. Dante Alberghetti's Divine Comedy was the next one in line. Lawrence read the Divine Comedy sequentially in 5 languages every night, like most people did the Bible. He'd start with the Divine Comedy and run right through one language and switch to German, and read it again, and that, switch to Italian, switch to French, and continually read it like some people read, as I said, the Bible. There were lighter books. The Last Days of Pompeii, Edward Leighton's, was a critical book to him. Ben-Hur, maybe there's another thing in Christianity there that might, in the history of Christianity, and how Christian that was, Lew Wallace's novel from 1870 or so. At any rate, I read these books, and then something happened. Lawrence began to talk to me. He talked to me from the characters throughout all these books. He would say after a meal, we would take a walk, and he would adopt a character and begin conversing about any issue, maybe current, maybe past, maybe even future. But the character he adopted was one which he wanted you to identify, and he wanted you to pick up a partner in that same milieu that book, into which that book was written. And then that way you began to communicate in various ways, and the most important thing that I got out of that was not only this deep interest in what these characters might have meant, but what it did to you as you were talking about issues, as you had to adopt other kinds of characters and look at other views in looking at issues. In this way, I found his world absolutely fascinating, almost like the simulations they play in Star Trek, where you walk away and step out in some other kind of world. And you did that thing as an everyday occurrence. As a matter of fact, you could not communicate with Lawrence unless you did it that way. Lawrence went to Rome a couple years later, so I only had 2 years of this rich and spirit experience, direct experience, and he studied in Rome. And while he was there, he sent me about 500 postcards, one every day for at least 2 years. They always started with some Latin-looking letters done surely in Roman script. Just letters. It took me quite a number of months to discover that the letters were short, abbreviated, or at least initials of a phrase. May the toucan be abolished from the earth. This was his nickname for me. So all letters started with a curse. But then they immediately adopted one of the characters. So it wasn't unusual, since he got a chance to spend a lot of time in Pompeii. He was a tour guide in Pompeii for 2 or 3 years. It wasn't unusual for him to warn me that Albaces or Arbaces, the dark Egyptian magician — I had to look at my notes to remember some of the names and characters — soothsayer, would be coming around the corner in his postcard message. Now, on a postcard, you wouldn't think there would be a lot of room, but Lawrence wrote microscopically, so it was impossible to read with the naked eye. He had to use a magnifying glass. And he wrote these immense, lengthy stories on one side of a postcard. On the other side was everything that meant the world to me. The Medici Chapel sculptures in Florence, the characters in Pompeii as the museums in Rome and Pompeii and Florence and Venice became part of his traveling time when he was a student over there. And so on one side of the postcard, I got myself back, my own desires. On the other side, I continued to play the characters and live the characters that he left me with and started me with. And so I, in some years later, ended my stay in the monastery and left. And that ended my relationship with Lawrence entirely. It was a tragic kind of ending, but there was no way that could be repaired. But Lawrence is the kind of guy who left me with so many seasonal and continual images in communication that even now, this time of the year, in this festival time, I hear some chains rattling and I hear his voice saying, "Ebenezer, what are you doing now?" So there was another one of the books, and that was Lawrence. How does that sound for time now?
After you talk about how you used to...
Okay, I lived with Lawrence about 2 years in the monastery, and then he got sent to Rome to finish his studies. Okay, can I move a little?
Okay.
Okay. Now in Rome, Lawrence did something very special. He sent me every day for about 2 years what totaled to be over 500 postcards. So I lived with Lawrence under those conditions, my training, communication, all that stuff, for about 2 years. And then Lawrence went to Rome to finish his studies. While he was in Rome, he did some very interesting things for me. First, he sent a postcard every day for about 2 years, a total of over 500 postcards. Very unique postcards. On the back, that is where you would write a message, Lawrence wrote microscopically, so small that you could not read them with the naked eye, but you had to read the story entirely with a magnifying glass. They all started with some letters, Roman-looking letters, and it took me months to decipher those letters. They stood for his expression, his greeting to me, a curse. May the toucan be erased from the world. You can see the issue of toucan and where I picked up that name for him. Well, the letters themselves did not depart from Lawrence's normal method of communication. They adopted a character, always in one of those 10 books or so. I guess it was over 10 by now. And you were to read them with the ears of someone who would be listening to that character in that book. The characters were, strangely enough, more Egyptian than anything else. Arbaces, the dark soothsayer from the last days of Pompeii, would creep around the corner, and the words of the note on the postcard would reflect this creepiness also. Or it could be another Egyptian, Balthazar, from Ben-Hur, who was an Egyptian Christian, and a very noble but somewhat secretive kind of person who was a fugitive from Christianity, had gone back to follow the life of Christ as this was emerging in the new world of Rome. And then I could also be the Swede, Lavrens Gustafsson, the father of Christian Lavrensdatter. And he would even have a Swedish accent, as you could see some of the words taken. And I would be Lavrens himself, and he would adopt some other kind of role, didn't matter what role, and talk to me about Rome and what he was doing. Well, 500 postcards later or so, Lawrence came back, and a couple years after that, I left the monastery, and our lives parted forever. They were no longer compatible. As a matter of fact, Lawrence, being a convert to Catholicism and a great monk, could not understand my leaving it all and hasn't talked to me since. But he talks to me almost every day of my life in some way or another. Even now, I think of this time of the year, from one of the books, I hear the chains rattling and I hear the ghostly voice of Marley saying, "Ebenezer, watch out what you're doing." And that was Lawrence.